Shelah Johnson is the recipient of 9 awards from the Society for Technical Communication and a published author who's produced and directed more than 40 lifestyle broadcast segments focused on eco and small space living. And she's with us here today to talk about Perpetual Gloom, which is the first book in the series The Boloney Trail. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How about you?
Yeah, I'm doing smashing. A little bit hoarse today, but other than that, I'm perfectly fine.
Yeah, we'll get through it. Yeah.
Yes. So the Boloney Trail, and in particular the first book, Perpetual Gloom, how would you describe the overall plot of it?
Well, it actually is based on a true story that covers around 3 generations. So the trilogy will be all three generations. But we start out in the 1930s, about 1936 to be exact. And we start looking at a family as they kind of go through the Great Depression and try to, kind of fix their financial situations, but it goes from bad to worse. And then ultimately, by the end of the trilogy, we see them kind of at that beginning of the Sinaloa cartel. So they kind of migrate across the U.S., but then eventually go down into Mexico.
Yeah. It's interesting because that's an era that's not often covered in books, is it?
No, it isn't. And I looked at this, and when you see like Breaking Bad, and I oftentimes kind of group this together like Grapes of Wrath meets Breaking Bad, because we have these 2 decades kind of things of going together. But what we don't see is like the beginning of the Sinaloa cartel. So what we think of it as where it sits today, but what were those early times like? So I've been able to interview the last bit of this family that was actually involved in this beginning as Americans in conjunction with Mexico. And it was a really interesting time for Mexico, too, because as this family eventually becomes embedded with smuggling heroin out and guns into Mexico. Mexico was going through this dramatic change, as was a lot of South America, with their political situation and trying to outlaw guns and things. And so they needed more of this. So there was an opportunity. And of course, we all know America is just like full of guns. So it's just like, and this family having tried, we see in the first book, for sure, in the Perpetual Gloom, where, they're really Christian fundamentalists. And you wonder, how do these dovetail into these, horrible crimes that we see that, go on between, not only drugs and guns, but also murder and, lots of other mayhem happening. So, yeah.
And you mentioned that you interviewed the last family of this era. Do you think it's quite important to interview people to get that primary source for research?
Well, I think it was important, especially when you're looking at, kind of capturing a story that's based on true events. And one case in point on this first book, kind of an interesting thing, I interviewed this person, and I had actually tried to track him down for, probably 4 years, and finally found him and interviewed him. And I had already kind of put this book together, but then I said, I finally found this person. I'm going to go interview him. And he came up with a story and photos and all of these things that actually I went home and kind of broke the story, the book apart to kind of incorporate some of these new lights, or stories that he had. And I think it makes for a much richer things, or things that I could not have in my wildest imagination kind of come up and kind of made up. I mean, these were just like, wow, So it took about a year longer after getting about 3 interviews with him to come back and break it apart and put it back together again. So So it took a little longer, but it was, I think, worth it.
Yeah. And of course, it's based on true events. Did you have to change a few things to make it more dramatic, maybe? Or maybe you just didn't know the full facts?
Well, here's what I did change in there. Obviously, the names. But what I did change was some of the order of things. So let's say some things may have happened one year, but I will put it in a different year because it made a better narrative where it wasn't such a choppy story, because there were things that were, that I didn't have in the middle to bring it all together. So the timelines may have changed a little bit because of maybe a year here and there. But I think that it makes the story flow better. The other thing that I did add to it, which I think in looking at 3 generations where the first book, we're going over 20 years, right? So there's 1960s to the 1950s. A lot of things have changed in the world. Music has changed, cars have changed, our eating habits have changed, travel, all of these things have changed. So, how do you actually carve a story that depicts these changing environments, the changing of the times, the changing of personalities? So I reached out and did a lot of historical research about what was happening during those time periods so that I could incorporate those into the story. So you will know what's happening around. So there could be a meteorite explosion, the biggest one in the world, or there's music that is changing, that there is some sort of, maybe it's a haircut, or something. But, that's always been a problem when I think that you're running a story over multiple decades.
Yeah. And what was it that made you want to write this book?
It's kind of interesting because when I was in college in English, I actually kind of started out to be a photojournalist. And photography was my first passion, or still is. But, but I started in English classes, and we would do these warm-ups and, write what you know, write what you know. And I already had a lead on this story at the very beginning. And I had 2 professors come up to me and say, you need to quit school, just drop out of school and go write this. And I was in my 20s. And I was like, I think you're just blowing smoke up my skirt. It's like, you just don't want me in your class because I'm a bad speller, something like that. But I always had that story. And then I said, well, I'm going to pick it up now. And it was kind of interesting because as I started to pick it up, and I was like 2 months or 3 months into it, a friend of mine in LA who's also a writer, she called me and she goes, hey, you remember that story you had in college? Do you mind if I pick it up? And I said, oh my God, how interesting, because I've already started it. So, it was, I guess it was just time. The other thing about that I think it's kind of interesting, at least for me, that if I would have started it in those early days, I don't think I would have understood the human complexity of it, because there are so many layers. And having lived a lot longer than, starting out in college, I have personally experienced some of these layers. And so then I think I would have missed those layers. And so I'm really happy that I didn't just run off and do it. I'm glad that it happened when it's happening, because it's much more interesting and has so much more depth, I think.
Yeah. And what was their argument for you leaving school to write the book? Because why would you have to leave school to write the book? Can't you still do both?
Yeah. I think I do a lot of things right now. I mean, that's kind of, my life, what I've always been dabbling in multiple things. I'm also, I'm a published photographer. I'm also an oil painter who, has run multiple series. I've also worked in technology. So I've written like the technical communication. So I have my foot in a number of things that I enjoy doing, all of those. But yeah.
Which one of them would you say you enjoy the most?
Well, I think it depends what time of day it is, or what I'm actually. I think at the moment I'm really enjoying writing because it's a challenge, and so whatever that challenge is. But I will say that between the writing kind of things, I will need to actually take a mental break and go do something else for like a week or so, and so then I'll paint, or I will do photography or something like that. I think that we need that balance, or like, if we're so immersed with it, sometimes we have to back away to see it. And so having multiple interests, I think, allow us to just kind of take those breaks. I know when I get stuck in writing, even if I get up and, let's say, sweep the floor or do the dishes, it's just like, it just gives you that little room to just kind of let your brain kind of settle a little bit.
Yeah. I suppose there's certainly a lot in this book, Perpetual Gloom, isn't there? How long did it take you from start to finish to write?
From the day that I decided to write it and the day that it was published was 6 years.
Wow.
Which is a lot.
Yes.
Because the next will not obviously take that long, because there was just so much, there were periods, that time period. Obviously, I haven't lived in that time period. So there was a lot to get to know about that. And there was a lot of research. This family also has a lot of legal material to go through. So there were court transcriptions, for example, to go through. There were a lot of other things, in that vein that had to go through. They also moved around the country a lot through the South, So each of those regions have different things. They were themselves involved in a lot of different things, and historical events. So I have volumes and volumes of research that I did. And actually, I was going to start out and just do one book, period. And then there became so much material there that it actually then kind of split off into a trilogy.
Yeah. And how are the next two books coming along? Will they be out soon?
Yeah, I'm targeting the second book, which is, which is coming up, which really kind of takes us really deep into Mexico a lot. And I would say that I'm a third of the way through, or a little more than a third of the way through. And I'm hoping to have that published. My goal is to publish by September. So it's a lot of work. Yeah. This book is 305 pages or something. The next book will probably be 400 and something. So it's a little larger, with more content in it. And then I have to deal with also a Spanish, so there's another language involved and another set of, historical researches for that time.
September isn't very far away at all.
Tell me about it.
Do you know where you're going to go with the third book yet as well?
I do. Yeah, I do. So we look at the main character in here, who is Monroe. And we kind of, he gets married in the last part of the first book, and we find him kind of going through his trying to adjust. I mean, this is a guy who stole his father's horses and in the South in Texas, and was riding his horse with his brother across to the California, which is thousands of miles. And so, this was, so he's an explorer, constantly an explorer. And then he's married to this, religious zealot, if you will. And so tries to hunker down to what a normal life kind of looks like. And he definitely has a difficult time doing that. And she is pretty animate about that. She wants the matching washer and dryer, So he's constantly looking for another way to get without destroying his family. So that's where that is, kind of that start of the second book. And then he has this he meets up with this person then who has a good financial opportunity for him. And he then explores it, then comes back and basically says to his wife that, Mexico, the streets are paved with silver. Yeah. And then the whole thing kind of takes off with that. And the children, coincidentally, are left stranded there also on their own, and they're quite young. So they kind of, for several years, are on their own. So, and kind of going in and out of the cartel kind of things it's flushing out around them. Yeah. And so they see some things that most children will not see, but I hope.
Yeah. Where can we find the book Perpetual Gloom everywhere?
It's on Amazon. And Barnes and Noble. Apple has it, and it's in paperback. It's also an ebook and audio book. So, pick whichever one you would like. And it's fast paced. I will say that. And it's pretty gritty in places. So, be prepared for that. People's lives were very different during different time periods. So I don't shy away from that at all. That is what it is.
Yeah. And you mentioned the audiobook, and we're going to have J.R. Santana on the show very soon to talk about the audiobook and the screenplay. So in the meantime, thank you very much to you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful. Thank you.